We did a specific video about Persian, which is called Bookish Persian. I introduced a variety of Persian, and it is associated with the standard written Persian, but also spoken as a particular style of speaking in very limited situations. For example, one of those situations would be you're a teacher speaking in class, and obviously you don't speak Bookish Persian, you speak most probably the Tehran Persian. But then suddenly you want to quote something from the physics book or a philosophy book. Then what you do is you shift into Bookish Persian as if you're actually reading a book. And then once you're done finishing the quote, you would be going back to the vernacular, which is an interesting dynamic in the language that could be associated with diglossia, depending on how you define diglossia and how strict you are in the definition and application of the term. This video is going to be useful for a person who is a non-Persian speaker and is learning Persian, because you need to know that the Bookish Persian you're learning from a book is not actually the way you're supposed to speak most of the time. And by most of the time, I mean 99% of the time. The interesting thing is, though, that Tehran Persian can be systematically derived from Bookish Persian. And there are certain rules that you can apply, or it's better to say there are certain patterns. I'm going to mention these examples because I want you to try to figure out if there is a systematic pattern here with which you can derive TP from BP. The word for is in Persian is ast. So ast in TP becomes e. The word for that is on. That's what you will learn as a PFL, Persian as a foreign language student. It becomes un, which means that. The word for yes, there's a few words. One of them is ari, which becomes are. Hammam, the word becomes hammum, which means bath. Khiyaban becomes khiyabun, street, road. By now, you should have been able to see some patterns. But then the same pattern does not apply. For example, so the word for Abadan is still Abadan. It does not become Abadun. It's a city name. However, there is a city called Kerman, which can be pronounced Kerman or Kermun sometimes. So it's also a city name. You could think that the pattern is arbitrary, but that's something that remains to be determined. Shekam, shikam, belly. Negah, nigah, look. Tekan, tekan, or tekun, but tikan is not allowed. Shake, shesh, sis, which is 6. Kuchak becomes kuchik, it means small. Khane, the word for home or house, becomes khune. Rasidan becomes residan. Nan, a famous example, becoming nun, bread. At this point, you might want to go and open your IPA chart and try to see what's going on here. For example, for the word kuchak, when it becomes kuchik, the a changes to e, you know that it's an example of vowel raising. And for example, for the word khane, which becomes khune, try to locate it on the table. It's khane a, becomes u, again an example of raising. Rasidan become residan, a to e, again raising. But you see there's sometimes a to e, sometimes a to e. Now I'm going to reveal some patterns in the way these changes happen. I'm going to give you the first and probably the most common pattern, which is the change of a to o or u. But let's, for the sake of simplicity, say change of a to u. The infinitive mandan, which means to stay, can become mundan. We already saw the example in khane and khune. So a may be raised to u. So the object particle ra in BP, in TP be raised to ro. The sentence an ra bebin can become un ro bebin, or in more rapid speech can become uno bebin. So here you have change of a to o. You have change of a to e, mikonad becomes mikone, he or she or it does. Again, you also saw in the table the copular ast becomes a. So you're just focusing on the vowel. And also a in a lot of verbs become a. For example, diğer, other becomes dige, means any more or other. Ager becomes age, which means if. At this point, I want you to look at the language you already speak and see if there is any vowel variation in your language. If you have that, that will be interesting to share in the comments. Another example. So the change of o to u. So the word khorus becomes khurus, rooster. Here you have, again, if you look at the table, you see that there's a one step raising of o to u. You could call this raising. Now, if you want to conduct phonological analysis, you could refer to this as raising. You could also refer to it as assimilation. Assimilation in the sense that the vowels assimilate, the following vowel influences the previous vowel, so it becomes regressive assimilation, and because they're not next to each other, it becomes non-contiguous regressive assimilation. It doesn't contradict the concept of raising, because you could say the way raising has happened here is through non-contiguous regressive assimilation. There are a lot of Arabic words in Persian that undergo the similar process. Ghurub, for example, becomes ghurub, which means sunset or evening. So I'm not going to analyze the other words to see what process they go through. I just analyze this particular process. But then the reason I did this was because in Portuguese, as far as I know, especially Brazilian Portuguese that I'm familiar with, just a little, you have a process that is similar to this, because words like tudo, in pronunciation, they become tudo. So the change of o to u, so this is a part that I said probably you could share from your language, because I know that in Portuguese at least, there is a raising of o to u. If they do exist side by side, you have a process of variation. But if tudo is a historical pronunciation and it has totally been replaced by tudo, then we are facing a situation of language change, which is it's a completed change. What the case is in Portuguese, I do not know, and I would appreciate Portuguese speakers commenting in the section. You need to know that in the case of Persian, it's variation, it's not completed change, which means that the words non and nun, both pronunciations exist side by side. Each of them signals a different style of speaking. If you have been doing linguistics for a while, you have probably come across the concept of universal grammar. Basically, all languages of the world can be explained using linguistics. In this case, you would see that if you're sufficiently theoretically minded, you don't have to be constrained by any specific language. You can look at the process. You can say, oh, the process of the variation between o and u, or change of o to u, depending on the situation, is a common process across the languages of the world. And then you could be looking at languages that undergo that process, exhibit that process. In this case, the languages are Persian and Portuguese. And you could compare them, but Portuguese and Persian are genetically related because they're both Indo-European, but this doesn't have to be always the case. You could find the same process between languages that are not genetically related. Anyways, this is some food for thought, and I will be seeing you in the next video.